Toby Fox's 2015 indie hit Undertale is an RPG meets bullet hell style game with a heavy focus on storytelling and player experience. What makes this game so interesting is its ability to create a world for the player where their actions affect the outcome of the story. This is done through the mechanic of choice, whether or not to fight enemies or solve conflicts peacefully. While this game presents some very innovative video game mechanics, it also presents a very interesting storyline with a narrative grounded in existential philosophy. The dichotomy between the different existential reactions the characters have represent the philosophies of some of the most famous existentialist philosophers, and help to create a stunning and thought-provoking narrative. With that said, Undertale is best enjoyed with little to no knowledge of the story for one's first playthrough. I'll be discussing some major spoilers in this video, so consider yourself warned. The premise of Undertale seems fairly simple to first-time players. Following a great war between humans and monsters, the humans created a barrier to seal off the monsters from the human world, confining them to what is known as the underground. One day a human wakes up having fallen into the underground. To return to their world, the human must cross the barrier between the two worlds. However, the king of monsters, Asgore, seeks to cross the barrier and enter the human world himself. For a monster to be able to break the barrier, they require 7 human souls, of which Asgore has 6. The player must journey to Asgore's castle and confront the king in order to cross the barrier and return home. Along the way, we are introduced to a varied cast of characters, many of whom have more complex personalities than they let on to. Throughout the game, the player must face foes and make tough decisions about how to progress. Undertale offers players the choice to kill enemies, or spare them and resolve conflicts peacefully. This mechanic allows for the possibility of 3 different endings: one if the player is a pacifist, one if the player kills some enemies but not all, and one if the player commits complete genocide. Breaking up the narrative into these 3 paths provides the player with a dynamic look into the personalities of its various characters. Each route reveals something different about each character, creating a meta-narrative around player choice. It is this meta-narrative that oozes existentialist ideas. To begin our analysis, let's look at the game's main antagonist, Flowey. When the human first falls into the underground, he/she is greeted by the seemingly friendly flower. While putting on a persona of helpfulness, Flowey's true ethical identity is shown during this first encounter through his quite memorable phrase, "In this world, it's kill or be killed." This is a reoccurring phrase for Flowey should the player follow the pacifist route. From this phrase, it is clear that Flowey subscribes to 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy of the master morality. Nietzsche's ethics were based on his existentialist belief that there is no inherent meaning in life. For human ethics, this meant that judgments of good and evil were based solely on one's subjective interpretations on what it meant to be good or evil. To Nietzsche, these types of ethical judgments were useless, since they were only relevant to the one making the judgment. From this evaluation, Nietzsche developed his view of morality, separating it into 2 categories, master morality and slave morality. The master morality values strength and power, while not concerning itself with what is judged as good or evil by society. The slave morality, on the other hand, values kindness, sympathy, and empathy. Flowey's kill or be killed attitude embodies the master morality through its emphasis on one's own strength and disregard for the concerns of others. If the player follows the pacifist route or the route of the slave morality, Flowey's dialogue after the player spares Asgore will reflect his disdain for the player's compassion, saying, "You idiot, you haven't learned a thing." So why does Flowey adopt this view of morality? To understand his motives, we have to look at his character's true identity. It is revealed in the pacifist ending that Flowey is actually the reincarnated soul of Asriel Dreamer, the deceased son of the king and queen. We learn that the player was not the first human to fall into the monster's world. There was a human child that had come before us. When that first human fell into the underground, the king and queen rescued the child and adopted it as their own. However, the human became ill and died soon after it arrived. After this tragic death, Asriel absorbed the human soul and used it to cross the barrier into the human world to return the body of his adopted sibling. However, seeing this monster holding a dead child frightened the humans, and they killed Asriel. When Flowey awakened with the soul of Asriel inside him, he realized the cruelty of the world. It is also noted at this point that Flowey learns about the power of saving. By this, I mean the game has broken the 4th wall, and Flowey has learned that he has his own save file for his life, which will reload should he die. To him, this means his actions no longer have consequences, since he can just reset his life. The combination of these ideas cause a shift in Flowey's worldview. He now views life as a meaningless existence in an uncaring world. Flowey turns away from the world which rejected him, adopting his kill-or-be-killed mentality, and beginning his search for a way to destroy this world. Moving away from Flowey, we will now examine one of the game's most interesting characters, Sans the Skeleton. Sans is a very enigmatic character. Very little is known about his history other than one day he and his brother Papyrus just showed up in the underground. Despite his lack of background, Sans' character development is really quite interesting. We encounter Sans several times throughout the game. Usually we find him slacking off. Almost always he shares bad puns and terrible jokes with us. The persona Sans presents at the outset of the game is a laid-back, carefree one. However, as the game progresses, we begin to see a clearer picture of Sans' worldview, and it is not as innocent as this carefree facade. The first inkling of a darker side to Sans is shown during our dinner with him at the Mediton Hotel. During this conversation, he tells us about his encounter with Toriel, the Queen of the Underground, who helps us very early in the game. He notes that if he hadn't promised her that he would protect us, we'd be dead where we stand. This bit of dialogue is one of the only times in the game that Sans' text font differs from his usual Comic Sans, likely to denote the seriousness of the statement. What reason would Sans have to want us dead? Does he know about the incident with Azrael and is distrustful of humans? We aren't necessarily given a reason to believe this yet. We see Sans' character develop the most during the Genocide route, where he serves as the final boss. During his boss fight, he talks about how he knows that one day, without any warning, it's all going to be reset, and that we'll just end up right back here without any memory of it, right? This cryptic statement refers to the fact that every time an attempt has been made to cross the barrier into the human world, their world is reset, due to the player restarting the game after they finished it. Sans is seemingly aware of every time you start a new game, which makes sense given that the Genocide route is not usually one's first playthrough. It's obvious Sans knows more than he lets on. He is aware of the ability to save and reset, just like Flowey. However, rather than adopt the master morality, he has a more absurdist reaction to this existential realization. In his boss fight, he goes on to say, "To be blunt, kinda makes it hard to give it my all. Is that just a poor excuse for being lazy? Hell if I know." With this dialogue, it is clear that Sans subscribes to the philosophy of absurdism, an existentialist school of thought developed by French-Algerian philosopher Albert Camus. The Myth of Sisyphus, an essay written by Camus, best describes this idea. In it, Camus tells the story of Sisyphus, a figure of Greek mythology, and his condemnation to an eternity of rolling a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back down whenever it reaches the top. This type of repetition demonstrates the futility of humanity's desire to find meaning in a meaningless world. The struggle Sans faces knowing the world will be reset parallels that of Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill, knowing it will roll back down when it reaches the top. To the absurdist, this means that one should embrace the absurdity of life and look for joy in the ridiculousness of one's daily life. This explains Sans' happy-go-lucky demeanor. He embraces the fact that his actions are meaningless, and uses laziness and comedy as a means of expressing this worldview. With all this talk of meaningless actions and master versus slave morality, it seems as though Undertale would make for a very depressing game. In actuality, the absurdist view of Sans and the kill-or-be-killed mentality of Flowey are representative of the obstacles one faces on a journey to create a meaningful world for themselves. Throughout the game, we are reminded to stay determined on our journey to escape the underground. This idea of determination is crucial to the game's existentialist meta-narrative. While Sans and Flowey represent two more negative reactions to existentialism, not all existentialist philosophy is so negative. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre is famous for the notion that there is no inherent meaning to life. Humans are condemned to be radically free. However, with this condemnation comes the assertion that we have the freedom to create that meaning for ourselves through intentional choices. In Undertale, the player gives their actions meaning through their determination to achieve their goal of leaving the underground and returning to the human world. By giving ourselves a purpose, the player can overcome the existential threats posed by Flowey's and Sans' philosophies. We, as the player, must come to the realization that our actions do have consequences. In fact, the player's choice to fight or solve conflicts peacefully has a direct influence on the outcome of the story. The message of Undertale is a simple yet powerful one. When presented with a world devoid of meaning, we have two choices: either wallow in the futility of finding meaning, or persevere and create meaning for ourselves. The recurring theme of determination solidifies this message, reminding the player throughout the game that the choices they make and the actions they take do have consequences. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you'd like to see more, subscribe and leave a comment down below. If you'd like to see a written version of that essay, it's over on my blog. Also, you can follow me on Twitter or watch me livestream on Twitch. Links for all those are in the description.